106 miles to Chicago. We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes. It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Hit it.
We're not anti-anything but hatred. We're not anti-anything but segregation, prejudice. That's what we're against. We're not against people. We are for people. And having said that, it's our turn. It's our turn. It's our turn.
First 9 for Harold Washington.
Good evening. The results of Chicago's three-way race for the Democratic nomination for mayor today took many in that city and the nation by surprise.
I think a lot of people thought that City Hall was going to turn black overnight.
The vast majority of the Democratic machine became Republicans.
Everything Mayor Washington wanted to do, we blocked.
In my opinion, at the present moment, Richard Mell, the vice mayor of Chicago, is the mayor.
This is going to be short. I am the mayor.
In America, 29 votes is more than 21 votes. And that's the truth.
Mr. Vasilatos, I've never run from anybody, including you, in my life. And I will be fair to everybody, but I'm going to insist that for the first time, the city is fair to you.
I thought he was going to be mayor for another 10, 15, 20 years.
We're number one, we're number one, we're number one. There was a time when you said Chicago and someone would respond like a Pavlovian dog, segregation. But now, anywhere in the world you go, when you say Chicago, you know what they'll say to you? How's Harold?
Incredible documentary. I've seriously got goosebumps again watching the trailer, having had the pleasure of seeing this film this past Saturday with my venerable co-host, Mr. Edward Heller.
Hey, Jerry. Yeah, that was such a great movie, Jerry.
And I know that I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I know that our other venerable co-host with the most, Kira Macoun, had an opportunity to see it today.
I did, and I was very excited to go see it, and I was excited while watching it and bawled my eyes out by the end. So, I mean, it was quite the movie-going experience. I enjoyed it incredibly.
And what's even more exciting is the gentleman who directed this film, Mr. Joe Winston. Joe has worked professionally in film and video since 1990. Recently, he edited the film Flannery, which airs on PBS's American Masters, and that was in March of 2021. His documentary film, What's the Matter with Kansas, was named one of the 10 best documentaries of 2009 by Roger Ebert. He also did field producing for Citizen Coke, a documentary that debuted at the 2013 Sundance Film Festival. This is quite a resume, my friends. His specialty has been editing documentaries and docu-style television, but he's also produced independent projects as well. Now, he also produced from 1989 to 1993, and I remember this show when I lived in Chicago years before I went out to Los Angeles, the cable TV series This Week in Joe's Basement, which I'm going to ask Mr. Winston about as it relates to Wayne's World, which came first. It was a public access show in Chicago, won 2 cable TV awards and media acclaim from MTV News, The Today Show, Jenny Jones, The Chicago Reader, Chicago Tribune, and News City. His 1997 documentary film, The Burning Man Festival, ran the film festival circuit and played on European television. In 1999, he was nominated for an Emmy for editing Lost in Middle America and What Happens Next for PBS. He's cut shows for History Channel. I have 2, which is a really cool gig to have. Discovery, National Geographic, Court TV, A&E, PBS, HGTV, as well as many segments of the Oprah Winfrey Show. Mr. Winston recently won, I believe it was also the Audience Award at the Chicago International Film Festival for Punch 9 for Harold Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest of the hour or 2 hours or however long he wants to stay with us, Mr. Joe Winston.
Hi, Jerry. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Wow, what a ride. This was, for me, it was like the best documentaries are like time machines because they transport you to that era and you forget everything that's happened in the present. But what was so very fascinating about this film, reflecting on Mayor Washington's life, was I think Chicago is kind of, I don't want to say they've forgotten his legacy, but we don't talk about it a lot. And I look at his service up to the point he passed, almost like that JFK moment. What could have been and what we lost. And I know that there had to be a lot of challenges for you making this film as a documentary filmmaker, not only from, sourcing the interviews to financial issues with raising the funding for it. There's so much to unwrap and talk about here, but I want to thank you for reminding us what it was like when Washington was alive, because it is really excited and happy and thrilled I was to see the film. It has left, and I'm actually feeling it right now. I feel some sadness that I feel a great man. We lost him so soon, too soon. So my first question for you is, how long have you been working on it? How long were you working on this project before you got to maybe what inspired you? I'm sure you were an admirer of his, but what inspired you to just decide I'm going to do this? Where am I going to start funding, financing? Take us a little bit through that journey, the origins of deciding to tackle this.
Sure. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you for having me on. I'm so glad that we can talk while the movie is still playing in Chicago in movie theaters at some 3 of the AMC theaters in town. So hopefully people will get to see it.
Let me interrupt you. I'm sorry. I hate to interrupt my guest, but the reason we wanted Joe on tonight, which I'm kind of headlining right now, is because it was my understanding that the film will only be playing in AMC theaters through this Thursday. So we want all of our viewers to go see it. Go see it while it's still in theaters. I believe I know it's running through Thursday. It may be extended. We don't know for sure yet. Maybe Joe will tell us. But everybody, while you can, that's why I wanted Joe on tonight, to encourage those of you who haven't seen it yet to see it before it's out of theaters.
Great. Yeah, and I think there's a good chance. Theaters decide week by week whether to extend, and ticket sales have been great. Chicago has been really supportive. So I think we've got at least one more week for folks to see it. So the journey, it began. So I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. I grew up in the Hyde Park neighborhood. I've always lived here. And so I was a high school student in 1983 when Harold Washington was first elected as Chicago's first African-American mayor. And so, of course, he was a gigantic neighborhood figure. Everybody knew who he was. And the election was incredibly fraught, even for a fairly clueless 15-year-old. The intense racism and bigotry on display was just obvious. I remember writing about it for the high school newspaper, the Kenwood Kaleidoscope. I went to Kenwood. Harold lived just a few blocks away. We would see him around the neighborhood. Some parents of friends of mine went to work for his administration later. So, it was this time in Chicago history that touched everyone who was a part of it, right? And then many years later, as an adult, when Barack Obama was elected as our first African-American president, I found myself encountering a lot of well-meaning white liberals who were just shocked at the response of the Tea Party and the sort of general white resistance to Obama's presidency. This was just something that people just had not expected. And I was just incredulous. It was like, what? Don't you remember Harold Washington and the Council Wars and what happened to him? And so that lit the fuse, I would say. The Obama presidency and the white backlash lit the fuse to make me realize that Harold Washington is not just a great Chicago figure, admired, revered, statues, libraries, and the rest, but that his story is kind of a political parable, a fable, as I see it, a way of understanding where all of this comes from, this fraught moment that we live in, where everything is 51 to 49%, right? And everything is racial, everything is political, everything is gridlock, deadlock, and partisanship. Where does all this come from? And I see Harold Washington's story in Chicago in the 1980s as kind of a Rosetta Stone for understanding this. Plus, he's a hell of a character. His opponents, Fast Eddie Verdoliak and Eddie Burke, who still has a city council seat all these decades later, despite the cloud of indictments hanging over him, they're all fascinating. Dick Mell, who kind of is the star opposition figure in our film, was a stitch to talk to. I really enjoyed talking with him. And it's a great story, and it certainly deserves to see a wider audience.
Did Mel have any self-awareness of people aren't going to be looking at what an opportunist he was, and how he jumped on Harold's campaign and then was very, very quick to jump into supporting Sawyer because they knew they wanted to install Daley. What are your thoughts on Mel now in retrospect with that?
Sure. And we're getting granular now in our Chicago politics, but I assume your listeners and viewers are sophisticated enough to follow.
They know the players.
Yeah. So in my movies, I make my films without the use of any narration, so that the participants in the drama are the ones telling the story. So in something like this, which concerns politics, it was critical to me and to my team to get both sides, as it were, of the story. We needed to hear from Harold's opposition. And despite many repeated attempts, Fast Eddie and Ed Burke were unavailable for comment. So
wasn't Eddie in jail?
He may or may not have been. Just like a lot of independently produced, grant-funded documentaries, this did take years to make. I think you alluded to that. We had to raise money and work for a while and then run out of money and then stop and write some more grants and beg for money and then start up again. And we all have other jobs and families and all the rest. So, yeah, it did take years. So I think that Verdoliak may have been in and out of prison. But regardless,
it finally took years for them to finally put him in jail where he belonged after everything we knew, all the corruption he was involved in here in Chicago. I mean, that was a nice – it's kismet that he finally ended up where he belonged after – we saw the kind of stuff he was doing.
Sure. Anyway, so it was critical for us to have some strong voices from the opposition. There's some other lesser known figures who speak candidly as well. I think some of them had never been interviewed before about this topic. And, Mel, to me, he was great because he is who he is, and he has no self-consciousness in the sense of shame. He basically told us, this is what I did. This is why I did it, why I opposed Harold Washington, and I would do it again, basically.
What really, one of the things I forgot, and Ed, you were sitting next to me when they showed the Bernie Epton commercial, vote for Epton before it's too late. I'm like, oh my God, I forgot that commercial and how overtly racist and dog whistling that it was to all of the white Democrats who are sadly racists who decided to suddenly vote Republican because Washington, right? Because they thought that suddenly, blacks are going to take over the city. It's like, well, that wouldn't be a bad thing. But I mean, in all seriousness, it's like he was about equity. He was about giving those that didn't have a voice of any color. So when you see, interesting, you speak to the white liberals who, back then would have identified themselves as liberal Democrats, but they decided to go hitch their wagons to Epton.
So the Epton campaign was something that shocked me at the time, and it's certainly very shocking to look back on not only the advertising, but also the responses of the voters. People in the 1980s were just more frank, right, about what they would say to a TV camera about how they actually felt, until I suppose the Trump years brought all this stuff back. Now racism's cool again. So it's like the turning of the wheel. But the underlying forces are the same, right? What you identified was that you had this large group of white voters who were certain that their privileges were at stake, right? That electing this black man, Harold Washington, would mean a loss of prestige, status, jobs, and money for them. This idea that there's a fixed pie, right, that you have to grab your share of it. I mean, this is what drives divisiveness in American politics. And you see it now, in the factory towns and blue collar neighborhoods all across this country.
And hang on to that piece of the pie too, without letting anybody else have a bite. I don't want to dominate so many of the questions. I know that Kira and Ed.
Well, I was actually going to, of course, like jotting down all these questions as we're talking, and just, on the coattails of that last question, I was wondering, in the movie, Harold Washington in the documentary, he talked a lot. And there were so many scenes where he talked about fairness between all of the races. And I was curious if, there were any Black organizations that might have pushed back against that rhetoric in the world of equity. And I was curious about that during the movie.
100%, right. So the genius of Harold Washington was that he had this vision, which was the only way he was going to govern a city in which no single group, racial group or ethnic group, constituted a majority, right? Chicago then was about 40% Black and white, and the rest was mostly Latino, Asian, and the other groups. So you had to piece together a coalition, and Harold and his supporters understood this. So his notion of fairness was genius, because simply by being fair to everyone was going to substantially uplift large groups of the city, especially African Americans, who were, part of his base. So, and this was a beautiful vision that people could get behind. And once voters in Chicago as a whole saw what fairness really meant, it meant more than just fairness to racial groups. Also, it meant fairness to neighborhoods that have been overlooked. You had even neighborhoods which happened to be white neighborhoods that had streets that were 50 years old and huge cracks you could drop a car into. And, lots of people have been left out by the corrupt system that was that had been in place for so long, right, under the Dailies and their successors. But you had another question besides about fairness. There was pushback right within the Black community, and with maybe not so much within the community. I can't speak to that from my research, but certainly within there were plenty of African American political operatives and politicians who were probably much more comfortable with the old way of doing things, maybe had come up through the machine and had sort of gotten their little slice, the lane in which African Americans were permitted by the machine to operate, their own perks and privileges, who were much more comfortable with that way of doing things than the idea of being fair to everyone. So yes, certainly, Washington had a very complicated job of herding all these cats of his potentially very fractious coalition. And it took a lot of stamina, a lot of work, and a lot of sheer political talent and charisma. I mean, and at the end of the day, it came down to his popularity with voters was what allowed him to keep politicians in line, even within his own group. And the fragility of that, of course, was demonstrated immediately upon his death.
Well, the film also kind of touched upon, he got rid of the patronage system, and a lot of Black politicians thought, no, don't get rid of the patronage system, start giving it to us. And he's like, no, it's not going to be based on who you know, it's going to be based on merit. And that's the one thing that I hope at that time I would expect that's what won people over. They realized it wasn't about, I'm going to elevate us by stepping on other people. I really do mean we need to all treat each other fairly and equally. And I think that was the brilliance of his politics.
He had the ring of power and he threw it into Mount Doom instead of putting it on, right? He could have, there were plenty of African-American mayors in cities that whites had abandoned, like Gary, Indiana, and Detroit and St. Louis, who probably embraced their own form of machine politics. And of course, and that did not uplift their communities in the way that they had hoped. It's impressive about Harold Washington that he was so idealistic and he stuck to his ideals to the very end. He stuck to his principles. He had real core beliefs that were unshakable, that he would not compromise on. And the idea of fairness, it really meant something to him. It was not just a slogan.
Speaking of ideals and compromise, this is a question I jotted down because I did not want to forget it. And I'm just going to read it so I don't mangle my thoughts with it. How do you think Washington would have evaluated the current state of the Democratic Party and the more pragmatist direction it now embraces? I mean, I would imagine that you probably, hopefully, have some intimate perception, some intimate thoughts on knowing the subject of your documentary. Would he have been held to the same standard now? Would he have been held to that standard by how he dismantled the patronage culture now? Because right now the Democratic machine is back, and and the neoliberal party seems to not really advocate for everybody. They embrace a pragmatism that kind of abandons, I think, the purity of what he was doing and trying to represent everybody. So had he lived, or had he, I think the quality of his character, I just wonder what your thoughts are on how, given the fact he didn't compromise, he was a man of integrity who really had some very, very strong ideas on how to do things with equity. How do you think he would look at our current Democratic Party?
Well, I mean, Harold Washington, when we say he didn't compromise, I think it's important to note he was active in politics professionally for decades, right? And before he was mayor, he was a U.S. representative in Washington, elected the same year as Ronald Reagan, and quickly became Reagan's archenemy, right? And worked with House Speaker Tip O'Neill to pass a reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, certainly when we say didn't compromise, Harold knew how to work the political system, which is part of what made him so effective as mayor. He had been in politics even in Washington, and certainly saw how the sausage was made there, and probably would have happily stayed in the House of Representatives for years and years and years, probably would have lived longer too.
Yeah. I have it always that the system brings in well-meaning people and then creates, corrupted politicians, right? And I've had a dismal view on politicians for a very, very long time, basically saying that everybody is corruptible. Harold Washington was in U.S. Congress for a long time, and then he had the 4 years as mayor in Chicago, and then was reelected and unfortunately died. But do you see any space where that corruptibility could have entered the scene for him?
Sure. I mean, Harold Washington. Yeah, Harold Washington. He was a state legislator in Illinois for decades. I'm not exactly sure when he started I think in the '60s through until 1980, right? So, and Springfield, Illinois, was a real swamp back then. It was notoriously corrupt, and he was only in Washington D.C. for a couple of years, but certainly he would have had many opportunities then, and frankly, as mayor, to enrich himself. And one of his friends, Bennett Johnson, who I just saw the other day, he's like 93 years old now. He was one of Harold's college classmates in the 1940s, and a friend the whole way through. Bennett Johnson told me that Harold died with less money than it would take to buy a house. And somebody who'd been in politics for 40 years. Who does that happen to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this might be a bigger question than the documentary, but how do we find more people like that to be running for public office? What do we listen for? What do we look for?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he's a figure of the 20th century, very much, Harold Washington, a time when things sort of continually got better. I think he was imbued with some of the optimism that entails. He didn't have a family. He was married briefly when he was young, and he was notoriously a bachelor for the rest of his adult years. He got accused by his opponents of being gay. For that reason, that was the kind of thing that in the 1980s was a slur against politicians, the sort of the Obama as a Muslim of its day. But so he didn't have a familial legacy of any kind, certainly. And the guy was just an interesting guy. I mean, there's one piece of video we have that was shot in his apartment. It was very spare, I think, except for a lot of books from I've seen the photos of it. I mean, he lived very simply. I mean, they're just, it's true. There are not too many characters like that in politics, certainly not today.
Definitely.
Ed, you've been kind of quiet. I know that you had a lot of thoughts that we were talking about in the car.
I just had to attack a troll in the chat there.
Yeah, I saw that.
I was just wondering if you had any perspectives on any of the current politicians. It feels like a lot of them are kind of using some of his rhetoric without necessarily following through on the actions. Are you noticing similar things?
Well, I mean, certainly Harold Washington had a lot of great rhetoric, which is worth emulating. But as you say, it matters what you deliver, right? And what made Harold so special was that he delivered. He had a program. He had a lot of expert people with him who, when he campaigned and came to office, he had an entire vision for the city of Chicago and what he planned to do. And I think that that was helped by the fact that he was 61 years old when he was elected Chicago's mayor, right? He was not new to any of this. And he knew it was going to be difficult and that it would require a lot of planning to try to execute. At the time that Harold was elected mayor, I think that the city itself may have employed more than 30,000 people. This is a huge army. And of course, many of them, when he was elected, were holdovers from the previous administration and more intent on throwing sand in the gears than actually accomplishing anything. So yeah, it comes down to what lots of politicians are good talkers, right? It comes down to delivering.
You know, following up on Ed's question, I noticed that there were some faces of the Democratic Party in the documentary that, yeah, use that rhetoric and have embraced less liberal, more neoliberal policies that tend to favor big business, forget about the working class. I figured that because he was a Democrat, there may have been an obligation, and it probably also helped get some of the interviews that you needed to include some of those politicians, most notably our formerly reviled mayor, Rahm Emanuel. It was interesting to me in that he, on one hand, he's sitting there celebrating the legacy of Washington. And then I love how you very, very deftly presented the moment that Harold passed. Instead of supporting one of the African-American candidates, he jumped behind Daley. He was ready to jump in behind Daley, which helped reestablish that machine and kind of pull back, I think, a lot of the advancements that Mayor Washington set forth.
Right. I mean, so, including an interview with someone in the film is not necessarily an endorsement. Just that each person, each person who speaks in the film, they have their own little piece of the story to contribute. And what made this story so complicated is there was no one or two people still living anyway who could see us all the way through this story. So, Rahm Emanuel is an interesting figure, and his career in politics did intersect the Harold Washington story at a couple different places. And that's where we used him. I mean, he had insights to offer that we found quite valuable. I don't remember him talking about Harold Washington at all in what we used in the film. He gave us his perspective on the Daley machine of that era. And when I think his mom used to take him in protests when he was a child, in those years, liberal protests. And then, of course, Rahm did have an important role in what happened after Harold's death and the succession and transfer of power to Daley. Rahm had an insider's view on that, and we wanted to hear what he thought.
I appreciate that you share that, Joe, because I certainly didn't think his participation in the film was an endorsement. But I guess I wondered that because, this is so focused on Democratic politics and some of the major players are still around, if there was an obligation to include them. But you framed it in a way that I understand and can appreciate now that, yeah, you'd have to talk to those people and I guess let the chips fall where they may as far as what they shared and how it makes them look or how people can understand them better. I guess maybe I also misremembered something. I thought, I don't remember specifically. I assumed from his participation, he was a Washington supporter, but maybe I'm not remembering that correctly. I don't know that he stated it. If he didn't state it in the film, I guess maybe I just misunderstood that.
Yeah, I think actually, the thing is, Washington kind of predates Rahm as being an active political player. I think his role in the Daley's 1989 campaign for mayor was his first participation in politics that I know about.
Okay. I think that there were some still images of him as a young man, and maybe I think that's where my misunderstanding was when there were pictures of him as a young man before he got more politically involved. He was a young man during the era when Washington was mayor. I guess I misread that as a support for Washington. So my bad.
Well, the tradition of these kind of pieces and the reason why people aren't usually flocking to movie theaters to see these biographies of great mayors is most of them, frankly, are tribute pieces. The kind of things you play before somebody's funeral. And Punchline is very different, as fits Harold Washington, who was a fighter and part of some incredible and very illuminating political conflict. The movie it's about conflict and action. And so we do have people in there to represent their different points of view.
When you wanted to take this on, directing it and putting your producing team together, I know as a filmmaker, you got to have the money to put something together and figure out a plan. What were the challenges for you when you chose to do this, and who did you approach to partner with to be able to do the work to present the story?
Sure. It was critical to me to have a good team around me. My lead producers are Raymond Lambert, who had done a movie on Maya Angelou. He executive produced with directors Bob Hercules and Rita Coburn-Wack. And Sonia Jackson, who had not made a film before, but came from the world of corporate philanthropy in Chicago. And they're both very talented, and they're both African-American, which was valuable. We had a diverse team. Generally, I thought that made the film better, because we had to kind of scrap and hustle and scrape every step of the way. There has not to date been a broadcaster or any entity like that has stepped in. We raised grants, we raised money from individuals, we won prizes. I mean, it's just sort of bit by bit by bit, brick by brick by brick to tell this. But neither Raymond or Sonia were from Chicago, so I had to win them over with a sizzle reel. That's kind of where it all started, making like a 3 or 4 minute kind of short subject to hook people into the story, an early version of what would become the trailer for the movie, right? And so that let me know that it was worth telling, that these are people who had not grown up with the story as I had, but were drawn in, despite the fact we all knew that this was going to be a challenge.
I noticed Bob Title in the credits. I went to Columbia with Bob, and I lost track with him, but we were friends back in the day. Who's my other so raising the financing, getting the production team together, getting the partners together. Once you had that support, because I think that this is like one of the most comprehensive retellings of his story, and that's why I'm just glowing about it, and I want people to go see it. Any other challenges once you put the finance together? So much material, stock footage, news stuff to go through to be able to piece everything together. How long did it take to produce the film? How many years?
Well, there was really 5 years of active work on and off on this thing. I mean, there was indeed a lot of archival material to find and sift through. I mean, that was sort of the fun part for a lot of us. The producers all got involved. We had archival producers, specialists who do this kind of thing for a living, young assistants who we brought up, who this was, maybe their first film that they'd worked on. We went to all the archives around, Chicago Film Archive, the Museum of Broadcast Communications, a place called Media Burn, which is a really valuable resource for independent video from the 80s, 90s, and before, and many, many other places, independent filmmakers. The Chicago Public Library has a whole Harold Washington collection where they have all of his papers, thousands of stills, off-air newscasts that were recorded by the mayor's press office. The one good thing that came of the silver lining of having to take so long to make a film, my kids were like in, they were like in preschool when I started, and now the oldest one's in high school, but at least they're old enough to enjoy it now when they went to see it in the movie theater. But the benefit of having so much time to think about it was that we kept discovering new resources as far as images and sound and other materials to tell the story, and that was a delight to find.
You make a good point. He really was a creature of his era, having served in office before he ran for mayor. And I just, as Kira was talking about earlier, how do we find those types of candidates? Could they even exist today? Because he dismantled the Democratic machine back then, and I wonder how he would view the current Democratic machine and the influences on it. It's all speculation. We don't have a time machine to bring him here, but with all the talk we do on politics here, I guess it's wish fulfillment that we can find someone like him to, I guess, address honestly what the failings are right now and how things have kind of mutated into something that isn't serving people the way that he wanted to as mayor.
One inspirational moment we had, a galvanizing moment, was when we brought on an educator, a guy named Dr. Asif Wilson, who's now with the University of Illinois, who's been creating curriculum around Harold Washington, and is now partnering with us to make one around the movie specifically. He was teaching at Harold Washington College, Dr. Wilson, and he asked his students, his incoming freshmen, most of whom were African-American, so do you know who Harold Washington is? And out of 100 students, only 15 could correctly identify him.
See, I feel like that's intentional. That more people in Chicagoans don't know as much about him as they should, which is why go see this movie before Thursday or into the next week. You need to know more about Harold to really gauge it against where we are now and why we are where we are, because all the progress he made got pulled back. That's what I walked away from the film thinking and wishing, how can we get that kind of, how do we find the candidates to move things forward again the way he did without compromising themselves in the way, with pragmatist agendas that really serve the few, not the many, the way that he wanted to serve the people of Chicago.
Well, I was gonna mention one of the things that I walked away from the movie with just an idea of what's actually possible, because I didn't really have too much. I knew who Harold Washington was, and I knew about the Verdoli Act 29 and all of that, but I wasn't there. I wasn't born and raised in Chicago, and so I didn't have that background of living through it. But to actually see someone come out swinging the way that he did and just never give up it just filled my heart so much with this optimism that I don't know that I ever feel in regard to politics. And I think that what this documentary does a great job of is really illustrating that possibility that there are people who want these things, and these things are possible. The other question inside of what's possible that I had is in regards to the media. So much of what we know and how we vote and the directions we take in our lives are based on what we hear in the media. And I know that the media environment was different back in the early 80s, because we didn't have so many voices, the internet and all of that. And I got curious about how someone like Harold Washington would fare in a media climate that we have today.
We also had more fair journalists back then too. I was really, the nostalgia factor of seeing a lot of our local news men and women covering things very fairly. I mean, I grew up during that time too, and I remember I really respected our newscasters and journalists here in Chicago, unlike the disrespect I have for so many now with agenda-driven propagandist news. But I'm sorry, I didn't want to step on Joe's response to that, but I did think it was worth mentioning that I think journalists and newscasters were of a higher caliber back then.
Well, certainly I would probably agree. They were bound by something called the Fairness Doctrine, which was in effect until 1987, which required presenting equal time to both sides of any contentious issue on a newscast, which made things like Fox News and frankly the current incarnation of MSNBC impossible in those days. Right now, interestingly, Harold Washington had terrible fights with the media of his day. There was only one or two black reporters at City Hall, and he was often talked about and treated with a great deal of condescension and contempt by the white-dominated news media. Monroe Anderson, who would have been one of the only black City Hall reporters of the day, still somewhat active in Chicago. He has a lot of stories to tell about this. This was a section of the film that in earlier versions had been more expansive, and we simply found that in the interest of time, we had to kind of breeze through it. But I think you can get a little bit of a taste of it. As a candidate, he was dismissed when he was running in primaries against Daley and then incumbent Jane Byrne, and he wasn't taken very seriously until they sort of had to. Monroe has these great stories, which we didn't get to include, about what the Chicago Tribune News was apparently like a funeral home where you could hear a pin drop after Harold Washington won the Democratic primary.
Interesting.
I mean, the news media was not neutral. Certainly his press secretaries, his last one, Alton Miller, who is still living for us to speak to, could talk quite a bit about how they felt the media was not neutral, that they were very much inclined to frame Harold as sort of bumbling or inept or partisan and blame kind of the rancor on him. And this is something kind of persists to this day, I think, in a lot of white establishment figures. So I don't know that the media was certainly different back then and less complicated and didn't make room for the fringe figures that we have today. But Harold certainly had his share of tussles with them, especially with Walter Jacobson. There was a whole film called Black Paul's White Press from 1985 by a guy named Marion Mozinski. It was on PBS, and it's on Vimeo somewhere. I think you can find it. That's this entirely about this topic of new Mayor Harold Washington having to deal with the largely white press corps, and fascinating how they had to adjust to him.
Jacobson always used to like to tussle with everybody. I guess I understand what you're talking about with print media, with the Tribune, because it's always been a more conservative newspaper as far as like I've been able to remember. But I guess I felt that television journalists and TV news, and maybe I'm wrong. I just remember because I watched a lot of TV news back then when I was younger. I didn't read the newspapers as much. And I wonder if you think that there was a little bit of a line between what you just mentioned with what happened at the Tribune and the white television journalists and anchors.
Well, certainly, Jacobson and Washington got in quite a bit of conflict. I recommend that film if anybody can dig it up online. We actually licensed some of it and we wanted to include, but it was another thing in the interest of time we couldn't delve into. But, the media had a tendency, for example, to present the council wars, which, lest we forget, was a term coined by comedian Aaron Freeman, right, as comedy. In Punch 9, it's taken seriously, so we couldn't include that either. But the media and television had a tendency to present council wars as spectacle. They had a tendency to blame the conflict on both sides. These are tendencies that I think that your viewers would find very familiar with the way the media covers politics today, right? There's a tendency, even when one side, usually the conservatives, is creating havoc, breaking the rules, or what have you, that the media finds that they need to be, there was a false equivalence or, the sort of fake even-handedness. That was certainly true in Harold Washington's day. And he had to fight against that. I mean, he had to try to break through that, often speaking directly to voters to get through the clutter of the spectacle of council wars, which Eddie Verdoliak was a master at creating, with all the shouting and throwing things at each other and all that kind of thing, and to get to the issues of what it was really about.
Yeah, I'm actually glad. Sorry, Jerry.
I
was glad that I got to see this movie because it pretty much was like the Cliff's Notes on how Chicago politics works. And for people who may just have had a surface level idea on Chicago politics, this really gives you the entire background story of who's fighting who and why. Like you were saying, Verdoliak is this evil, like WWE wrestling villain kind of character, and so you're watching this movie and you can see what they call kayfabe, where they're basically doing performative art in front of TV cameras because they are not getting their way, and they're making up stories about Harold, and you're like, man, not much has changed there, except it's just a different way that they're reaching out to people now, and a lot of people are able to see through it.
And I would argue that the reason why a lot of things haven't changed since the council wars and the Harold Washington era is because the underlying conflicts, what folks are fighting about, is very similar, right? It's equity, it's power, it's who gets their slice of the pie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you had mentioned earlier that, this was, and maybe it was in the documentary, maybe it wasn't in this conversation, but, a playbook for how the Republicans treated Obama, where they basically obstructed everything that he wanted to do. And one of the things that made me like want to jump out of my seat during the documentary and just be like, hell yeah, right? Like, yeah, was, the hardball Washington played, going ward to ward and just basically pointing out very, very simple things that people want, like, their roads paved and their neighborhoods taken care of. And I think, what's missing today is, we have the Republicans taking the playbook, from the council wars, but we don't have that opposition side that's going, district to district, state to state, and really playing hardball. And I really think that illustrates how collapsed all of the parties have become, and how there isn't actually opposition anymore. And I was curious after seeing that how that would play out on a national level or even a state and municipal level now. And why is nobody playing politics like that anymore.
Right. I think Harold Washington, and you're right, and the way that he built his coalition and the way he talked to voters, I think is well worth emulating. Of course, he didn't have the problem that Democratic and liberal politicians have today, which is the need to please donors. For his 83 campaign, one of his press secretaries told me that he never had to raise any money. Let's not forget that Harold Washington was buoyed and brought to power by a political movement, multifaceted, that had been going in Chicago for decades. Activists from the 60s who'd fought against the Vietnam War and fought against Richard J. Daley, who were still active and still going and were registering voters and going from neighborhood to neighborhood and reaching out to all sorts of different communities. Like, that infrastructure was in place, and it had to be in place in order to put somebody like Washington in office. A lot of us tend to look for a singular figure, and certainly somebody as charismatic as Washington or those who followed him like Obama seem like singular figures, but it really takes these broad coalitions to change the structure of power.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought up.
I was going to quick follow up on that. Was there anybody that held Washington's feet to the fire? Were there those groups, and did he need those groups to be pushing him?
David Orr, who was vice mayor under Harold Washington, and he was mayor after his death for 4 days, told us that his last conversation with Harold was about just that Washington had just been reelected. He was finally powerful. He finally had control of the city council. He could enact his agenda without obstruction. And he said to David Orr, he said, look, you've got to tell all these outside groups, like, keep protesting, keep pushing, because this is hard. Change is hard, and I can't do this alone. And so we need to keep our eye on the ball. And I thought that was really, really wise and interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I wanted to reference, you brought up President Obama, who was clearly very, very inspired by Harold's campaign, the rhetoric. And as we talk about, earlier, Washington not wanting to compromise or fold on certain ideals that he held very, very strongly. Sadly, I think that the pragmatism that President Obama embraced was kind of contrary to what Washington was like and was about. And I guess I'm maybe answering my own question as far as when we were talking about how the Democratic Party has changed with our current politicians needing to be more pragmatic, which really kind of dilutes those that they're supposed to serve as opposed to the donors. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there too, was Washington wasn't beholden to donors. And the structure of the donor system now is why representatives, leaders like Obama maybe have to embrace that pragmatism that, unfortunately, I think poisons what they claim that they set out to do in the beginning, and maybe at a point where they really were sincere about it. But as you go into the fire and you have to change to serve and satisfy so many different people, I have some very, very very profound disappointment in the Obama that I voted for and the Obama who left and who's parasailing with Richard Branson right now, with the Netflix movie deals and stuff.
Sure. It's a different time for sure. And we didn't get to sit down with Obama. He does appear in the film in some interviews when he was much younger, and hadn't been through the ringer. And then also we see him in news footage more recently, kind of reflecting on things. You certainly wish he'd studied the Council Wars a little more closely.
Yeah. Ed, anything?
We got, let's see. We got one question in the chat here. Why didn't Eugene Sawyer carry on Harold's mantle? I think some of us know
he wasn't
the answer to that.
Yeah, well, they also, he was, although his son, who's now running for mayor, he's been very vocal about the fact that his father was not there to act as a bridge for Daley. And I think, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Joe, as far as Sawyer?
Yes, this is a very interesting question that your viewer poses, actually, and something that we touch on in the film, but only very briefly. So, and we did sit down with Alderman Sawyer, who's Eugene Sawyer's son, and he had quite a bit to tell us. So Eugene Sawyer, you might recall, right? He was appointed to office in an epic all-night council session that went until 4 o'clock in the morning, and he was appointed by majority white, majority machine aldermen. So who got to choose between him and another Harold Washington ally, Tim Evans, right? Who's now a chief judge. I think he's still on the bench. Anyway, so Sawyer. So my view of Sawyer personally is that he was just doomed from the beginning, as someone who had not been endorsed by the voters and who was seen as, fairly or not, right, as being under the thumb of the very same politicians who had opposed Mayor Washington. That he was appointed under a cloud, right, where he just couldn't win, right? Nobody was really for him. It was a brilliant move by the opposition, right, to install a black guy that the black community could not get behind. Checkmate, basically. And unfortunately, Sawyer confounded things by not being the very most talented politician ever. I mean, even Monroe Anderson was his press secretary at the time, and is a major contributor to Punch 9. And Monroe said the press used to call Sawyer Mayor Mumbles, for his relative inarticulateness, right, which was a dramatic contrast to Harold Washington.
Certainly.
So holding the Washington coalition together, very fractious, many different groups all competing with each other for perks, for benefits, for also just for policies, for things that they wanted to get done and what gets done first, would have been challenging for almost anyone. But Sawyer, unfortunately, was probably not gifted enough to be up to the task. But he does get kind of a short shrift because of what happened, and certainly his son feels it's unfair to label him as just a stepping stone to Daley. And it's interesting to note that he kept on a lot of Harold Washington's appointees, and that he continued many of Harold Washington's programs too. It's tempting to suggest that Harold Washington's entire accomplishments were washed away by Daley like a sandcastle on the beach, but that's not really true. I mean, there were things that Harold did that simply could not be undone. Certainly the fairness, that he instituted for blacks, for women, for gays, for Latinos, many groups that have been systematically excluded. That just wasn't acceptable anymore, right? Every mayor had to at least pay significant lip service to inclusion of people from all parts of the city, people from all neighborhoods too. Harold instituted the idea that every neighborhood should get services. That could not be undone. So some of his ethics reforms were not completely undone. So, Sawyer, I see as sort of a tragic figure who was sort of doomed from the moment he stepped into the mayor's office.
When you speak about the families too, I can't help but remember that moment you had with Bernie Epton's son. I mean, his family knew what was going on, although Epton approved all that stuff. Epton knew what he was doing, but his family knew how wrong it was, what he was doing, and are broken by that to this day. As we also talk about mayoral candidates, we're talking Roderick Sawyer, Alderman Sawyer, who's Eugene Sawyer's former mayor, Eugene Sawyer's son, and the current crop of candidates. Ed and I were talking after we walked out of the theater. Harold kind of came from the street, was in the community, and all we hear about now is like, well, this candidate's got that experience, this candidate's got that experience. Yeah, well, all their experience hasn't changed anything to make me want to vote for them. I don't want to start talking endorsements here, but one of the only candidates running right now that I feel has a lot of the same grit coming from the streets, being involved in the community, is Jamal Green. And I know that Jamal Green is a great admirer of Mayor Washington. And as I see, the current crop of candidates, Jamal is actually out there doing stuff fairly the way I think that I know that Washington did. So, I think that as voters, we really have to challenge ourselves and think, despite the fact we've got this candidate and that candidate who've been in service all this time, claiming it's their experience that's going to change things, maybe not. Because clearly their experience hasn't changed anything if they are now claiming they're going to change things when they haven't been able to do it. Maybe we need to look at new blood. Maybe we need to look at younger people who don't have that experience, who haven't been corrupted by the system, who have actually been serving their communities, who not only, talk the talk, but walk the walk. To Kira's point earlier about where do we find those types of candidates? And with all respect to Alderman Sawyer running, I know a lot of that also has to do with his father's legacy. We've got another mayoral campaign coming up, and we like to reference the new mayoral campaign as the mayoral clown car because of all the candidates that are going to be running. But there are a lot of people we need to look at and vet and really get to the heart of who really does have that sense of fairness in mind in representing everybody, and not looking at this as I'm going to be pragmatic and sell myself out and do this, that, and the other because of so many people, this person, that person's giving me all this money. It's all about the fundraising. What are some of your thoughts on the upcoming mayoral race? Because we're really just crossing our fingers that all that money from the Democratic machine doesn't stick Lightfoot back in power again.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm more interested in endorsing ideas for what I would like to see happen in Chicago than endorsing particular candidates.
Yeah.
I mean, as there are many. I mean, the thing that interestingly depresses me the most is the incredibly low voter turnout that we've had to endure for decades. Actually, I would see some of that as being a product of the precinct captains, the infrastructure of the old Chicago machine going away. That certainly made sure at least people showed up and voted. All right, so maybe they were just pulling the lever and didn't know who they were pulling it for at times, but often they did. Right, in Harold's case, Harold Washington was elected in a 90%.
90%. Ed and I looked at each other. We're like 90%, knowing that right now it's 30%. Remember that moment, Ed?
I think I audibly gasped when I heard that number.
Yeah,
I was wondering. I'm like, what's it going to take to get people that excited about voting again for a mayoral race? And I don't think I have the answer to that yet.
Yeah, that's the key, is the turnout. I think nobody turns out because it doesn't matter, because the person who's not going to represent what we need is going to lie to get in there. I just think people are just absolutely beaten down with thinking it's not going to matter because money's going to buy that seat and nothing's going to change. And I guess, to your point, Joe, we got to talk more about the ideas and get people to realize, as hard as it is to muster yourself and think that it's going to make a difference, you got to take that first step and go out there and vote. If it's not one of the main candidates, I always say this: find the candidate that best represents your values. Stop thinking about, it's always going to be two-party, because the less you start thinking two-party and seek out the candidate that represents your values, whether you think they're going to win or not, the more people that seek the candidates that are representing their values, not just the ones that represent one of two parties, that's how you start getting the better candidates out.
Sure. It feels to me like Chicago voters, lost the habit of democracy under 21 years of Richard M. Daley, and just kind of lost faith in the idea of competitive elections, right? And that we're having to kind of grow these muscles back again. So it just may take a while. I mean, I'm seeing some encouraging signs that various people can run for office, and there aren't always clear favorites. And, whatever you want to say about Lightfoot, I mean, I don't think anybody really expected her to be mayor until a few weeks before she was. So that's surprising.
Well,
maybe there are other surprises to come.
And she represented things that she has not carried through. I mean, that's the biggest. I voted for her, and I think she bamboozled all of us. She was going to be the progressive reformer. She's not. She's become a creature of that Democratic machine while she's pretending like, she's carrying on Harold Washington's legacy to the communities that, her policies have abandoned, that she's got out there canvassing and collecting petition signatures for her. It's shameful. I mean, in my opinion, but so no. I think that the more people that see your film too are hopefully going to be inspired to telling their friends, sharing with other people. Harold was an inspiration to taking action, basically, re-energizing yourself and saying, it's not hopeless. We can't give up. We can't give up.
I think that's an excellent message to take.
We've got extra bullet in the chat here. How many dead people voted in Chicago? My dad used to talk about that when he lived there.
It was during Daley's regime, mostly, I think.
Yeah, it was that, and then the other the phrase "vote early and vote often." So I mean, I don't know how much of that had to do with the election of Harold Washington, but maybe those subsequent elections.
Yeah, those factors would have worked against Harold, of course, since he was the non-machine candidate, right? The name Punch 9 for our documentary right, comes from the practice of candidates in those days having to give their ballot number, because if you were running against the machine would find somebody with the same last name and put them on the ballot to confuse the voters. And so you had to make sure voters knew that you were the number 9 Harold Washington, not the number 13 Howard Washington. It was some janitor that the machine politicians found to run against you and split your vote.
Yeah, it's every year they come up with a new set of shenanigans, and sometimes it's the old sets that you just haven't seen in a while.
Well, I mean, the current tactic is clearly apathy, right? I mean, the voter turnout was something like 30% in the last election. It's less than a third of what it was in 1983.
The film has won 4 awards so far. Any more that haven't been announced or added to the poster yet? You've got the Martha's Vineyard African American Film Festival. You've got the Chicago International Film Festival. You've got Doc New York City and the Santa Barbara International Film Festival so far.
Yes, it was wonderful. We were selective with the film festivals. Now we're playing at the AMC movie theaters. We did a week in 18 cities across the country. And we're continuing in Chicago, which, of course, where the story is of special interest. And we have the best moviegoers in the entire country.
We do.
And let's see if we can keep knocking on the doors of the big streamers and get somebody to cut a deal.
I really hope so, Joe.
Yeah.
Not that you should be in any rush, because you got some room to breathe now that this magnificent story is out there for people to see and share. But what's on the horizon next for you? What are you looking? Do you have future projects that you're thinking about lined up that you're going to be jumping into?
Well, this film will have a long life of its own, and including the ability to have community, bring it to the communities and educate people and bring it to schools. I mentioned earlier we're developing a whole curriculum about it. So my team and I have to keep. We have other projects on the back burner, but we got to keep our eye on this one. Because it ain't easy bringing these kind of stories to the public, even in this age of seemingly infinite choice, somehow all the movies end up being about rock stars or murder or other sort of lowest common denominator, factors. So the things that used to be relegated to PBS, still you have to fight to get them recognized. And so until Punch 9 is available to everyone, we're not going to take our eye off the ball.
I seem to recall not too far back that there was a filmmaking team here in Chicago that was trying to produce a dramatic version of the Washington story. I don't know that I would want to see it acted out as a docudrama. I think that this film, you need to see the real man and the real players at that time. I don't know that you could cast. Well, maybe you could find some fine actor to play Washington, but I mean the supporting characters, the Eddie Verdoliaks, the Burks, it's just like they are already characters that you have to see operating in person in the documentary footage.
Stranger than fiction, as we like to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and there was one other thing I felt like I interrupted you in the middle of a thought, and I didn't mean to, but as we were talking about the amount of people that don't really recall Washington's legacy in Chicago, you were talking about the educators and that only 15 students out of 100 knew who Washington was. Could you extrapolate a little bit more on that? Because I think that maybe I got excited and shared something that maybe cut you off from a point that you were going to take that towards.
Well, of course, Harold died, I think it'll be 35 years ago this November. He died just before Thanksgiving. So there's, an entire generation of this country, right, that has been born since Harold Washington died. And of course, because his political opponents, by and large, were able to take the mantle of power in Chicago, to me, there was this terrible risk of the Harold Washington story being Santa Clausified, right? That he would be just reduced to a personality and that we wouldn't remember what he was really about. So part of the mission of making this documentary and trying to make it as engaging and entertaining and as broad a reach as possible is to re-engage the public with, who Harold Washington really was and what he did and what he fought for and what he fought against.
Kira, did you? I wasn't sure. So it looked like maybe you wanted to add something.
No, I'm good. I thought that this was a great interview. I thought it was a great movie. I just thought it was a great interview. I'm so grateful that I got an opportunity to learn more and to, fill up that cup because there was so much that I wasn't aware of, and it does definitely shape in my mind where we are today, largely. So yeah, I mean, I thought it was great. And that's all I got.
Ed, any parting thoughts?
I just have I'm gonna kind of put my tinfoil hat on here just for a second, if that's okay. Someone in the Rokfin chat asks, who killed Harold Washington? And well, we've seen the movie, and and the official story is that he died from natural causes, because we know the man didn't really take very good care of himself.
Yep.
He was a smoker. He and like a lot of politicians, like they put food in front of him, he's going to eat it, and he probably didn't have a great history with cholesterol, my guess. But in your time doing research for this project, did any kind of conspiracy stories come up regarding how he died?
The loss of Harold Washington was a tremendous blow to many Chicagoans, and a particularly painful one for the African-American community, who, of course, can't help but remember what tended to happen to civil rights leaders of his ilk, right? Black men who fight as Harold did tend not to die in their sleep. So it's only natural that a lot of African-Americans in Chicago, regular folks, it is a widely held view, commonly held. I wouldn't say majority, but many people do hold the view that Harold was somehow murdered, poisoned, or assassinated. And it's very understandable why people would feel that way. His death was so sudden and so shocking and so brutal and such a setback, right, for the cause. And if he were to have been assassinated, it would have been so typical of what happened to all the civil rights leaders that preceded him. However, speaking to Harold's close associates, friends, confidants, they have a million stories about his terrible lifestyle. He wouldn't see his doctor. He would be driving to see his cardiologist and then get a call from City Hall and then turn right around and blow off the cardiologist and go back to City Hall. He had an exercise. People kept giving him exercise bicycles because he was young. He'd walk everywhere. When he was mayor, he couldn't walk anywhere, right? And so he would have exercise bicycles that a year later would have 1.5 miles on them. When during the 4.5 years that Harold was mayor, he gained 65 pounds.
Holy buckets.
And you can see it in the footage in the film. It was a bit of editorial discipline that we could not cut scenes of him out of chronological sequence very much, because he visibly aged while in office very quickly. He gets much heavier, much grayer, and much more exhausted. The guy worked constantly. I mean, so we touch on this in the film from his close friends and associates, and the way Harold describes himself, right, as somebody who really literally worked himself to death. So for me, I'm very comfortable with the idea that terribly he did die of natural causes. We also had the story we couldn't include from Alton Miller. His last press secretary was actually in the room with Harold when he collapsed right in front of Miller at a meeting and was promptly rushed off to the hospital. So interestingly, a lot of what then used to be called white ethnics, or white voters who were not necessarily supportive of Harold, had this prevailing view that he was either gay or a cross-dresser, or there's this rumor that he was found wearing women's underwear when he died. And there was a very controversial painting the year later that was hung by a student at the gallery at the Art Institute, right? I forget exactly what it's called. Mirth and Girth. Yeah. Anyway, so look, Harold was a larger-than-life, almost mythic figure, right? And the values that he stood for are everlasting. And the battles that he took on and he joined were titanic. So he has this mythological force on people that no one can believe, of course, that a guy like that would just die of a heart attack. That's just too banal. It's just too ordinary, right? He must have been slain by his opponents. How else could such a hero not live forever? But alas,
And I think his family and close friends would have certainly seized on if there was any foul play. The fact that you did present that and shared that they were comfortable with the coroner's report of what happened. But everybody wants, as you say, how can a larger than life figure like that go in the most banal way? Right. So I mentioned this at the top of the show when I shared your bio. So which was first, Wayne's World or inside downstairs in Joe's basement? This week in Joe's basement.
This Week in Joe's Basement, right, which was, kind of similar to this enterprise, except we had only one camera at a time.
Yes.
in the world of public access cable television that still exists in some form. I was on a panel talking about it not that long ago. And actually, if you search the internet, the Onion, some branch of the Onion made a little movie about me and This Week in Joe's Basement and Wayne's World and how it all ties together. I was hired when Wayne's World was made into the skit was made into a movie in the early 90s. The Tribune hired me to confront Mike Myers, the star and creator, or one of the creators, with your question exactly. You know, why did he steal Wayne's World from me? And Mike Myers, well, he said, like, what are you talking about, dude? I live in Canada.
I think everybody's got a public access TV show that was probably like that, you know.
I actually had that
not to
article
take
up.
away from yours.
Oh, that's awesome.
There was questions. Yeah, I actually had the Tribune article up when I was doing my research on you, Joe. Interesting enough. But Myers never was familiar with your show to have taken the idea to kind of poke fun at. You know,
the two very different enterprises, really. It's just the title of my show resembled the concept of his Saturday Night Live sketch.
Got it. Okay. Cool. Well, listen, Joe, anything else you want to share with our audience? And we're going to probably try to cover a few news stories here. And you're welcome to stay with us. If you can't, no sweat. But I wanted to give you the final word.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, everybody involved in Chicago Corner, for having me on. It was really fun to talk to all you guys. And I hope that some of your viewers make it out to an AMC movie theater nearest them to catch the movie. There's nothing like seeing something in a theater and getting to talk to people about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I cannot encourage our viewers enough to go out and check out this movie before it's out of theaters and watch for it after it's out of theaters. Do you think you guys are going to get a physical media release? Because I'm not kidding. I have hundreds of Blu-rays behind me in my library, and I really want to add this one to my Blu-ray shelf.
Of course, our mission is to bring this to everyone through every medium that we have available. We'll get there, and we'll get there.
Cool. Everybody, the website is punch9movie.com. Please check it out in theaters if you can in the next week or so, definitely through this Thursday, hopefully into the next week. Joe, are you able to stick around, or do you have anything you need to attend to?
I got to take off my Superman costume and go help my kids with their homework. They have tests this week.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us. This was a real thrill. And keep up the good work, man. You're an inspiration along with your film.
All right, Kira, Ed, Jerry, thank you very much.
Okay, take care.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Wow.
Woo!
I have a new hero.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah. Great work, Jerry.
He did the work. I just got inspired with Ed, to which we told Kira, is there any time you can see this before Tuesday? Because I really want to be able, because I reached out to him after we saw the film, and when I went online to the website and saw it was only playing through Thursday, I'm like, I don't want to hijack Kira's show, but if it's only going to play till Thursday, we only have a finite amount of time to share it with the audience. And Kira was so accommodating, and I was glad to hear it's going to go past Thursday.
I think there are more important things than me being a star, you know?
We never want to take that away from you.
No.
But,
nobody ever could. Let's be clear.
Okay? That's true. But Tuesdays are Kira's show, so she's back at the helm.
Here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Tuesday's Chicago Corner. I'm Kira Macoun, your host.
I don't want you to turn into a pumpkin. And how much time have we got left?
I don't know what that comment's about, but I'm putting it up anyway. It's all good. I put together.
Yes!
Exactly. And thank you to Constitutional Conservative. We appreciate it. And then, also Constitutional Conservative is asking you on a date, Jerry.
Asking me on a date?
Yeah, he wants to go see the movie with you.
All right, I got to fess up, everybody. I've never wanted to admit this in public, but Constitutional Conservative is my first cousin. I didn't want people to know we're related. The jig is up. The secret's out. This is why I have absolutely no hesitation in busting his balls here as we do in real life. My cousin Lou, Yeah, if you want to go see it again, I'm totally willing to go see it again, Lou. So yeah, let's see if we can make some time this weekend. Or I think it's a pretty sure bet it's going to go for another week, even though AMC hasn't formally announced it. I think Joe was able to share with some certainty that it's going to go another week. So
so if it's check punch9movie.com, see if it's playing in your area. Definitely worth watching. Like I said before, it's totally going to inform you as to how Chicago politics works, what the origins are of how all of these politicians behave today, and how they behaved back in Harold Washington's era. And it will be extremely enlightening in how you can react to how politicians are interacting with you today.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. Awesome. All right. You guys ready to dive into just a few stories, a handful of stories?
Hey,
here?
let's do some more stories.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot recently, with good reason, about the fact that the Chicago Housing Authority keeps basically giving away land that was set aside for low-income housing and repurposing it for things, like soccer facilities, or like high schools that aren't really necessary.
For profit vultures, not the people.
And the CHA has to go through HUD before those deals go through. So, that is supposed to be a little bit of a gatekeeper for, to keep these things from happening. So let's say loosely, right? A ProPublica article that came out last week pointed out that, in fact, over the last decade, HUD has never blocked a public housing land deal in Chicago, according to records from HUD and the Chicago Housing Authority. The word never there, I mean, the fact that that is printed in an article blows my mind. Anytime people use the terms never and always, I almost immediately stop believing them. So looking at this, I was just shocked to see that be uncovered, that they never had turned down, a land deal. With HUD's consent, the CHA has essentially become a land piggy bank for other government agencies and the private sector. Through sales, leases, and swaps, the agency has turned over land for 2 Target stores on the north side, a privately owned tennis complex on the south side, and infrastructure in gentrifying neighborhoods, such as a firehouse and a police station on the near west side. HUD ultimately approved more than a dozen land transactions while applying little pressure on the CHA to measure the benefits for residents or produce more affordable housing. In several cases, the agency agreed to accept far less than the property's market value. And we'll go through just a couple of examples, but just so everybody knows, this was a very long article. So there are many examples of, that actually echo the few that I'm just going to mention today. Come on, Chicago gives out 99. Oh, there's a 99-year contract that I'm going to be talking about today. So hold on to your hats, people. All right.
I was thinking, Kira, it was just the 75-year contracts, but there's a 99 as well.
There's a 99. Yeah, I think that there are a couple 99-year contracts. There is one that was mentioned in this particular article as well.
This is such a crock of shit.
The approvals in Chicago are part of a larger pattern. ProPublica found that HUD routinely signs off on plans to get rid of property owned by public housing authorities across the country, including Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee. In Chicago, the CHA justified its actions by saying the deals would generate more money for housing. Yet, yet the project, Jerry's going to spit out his drink.
Actually just did.
Yet the projected units have been delayed repeatedly, and some didn't materialize at all. All right. This wasn't what was promised. In 2000, HUD officials helped the CHA launch its plan for transformation, a citywide effort to dismantle and redevelop public housing sites. As the CHA leveled most of its apartment buildings, thousands of families had to find new places to live. Within a few years, the agency was sitting on blocks of open land. Officials committed to building new homes for families with a range of income levels. The near West Side deal that Lightfoot is pushing would let the Chicago Fire build a new practice facility on CHA-owned land that was long reserved for new housing, which we talked about here on Chicago Corner. The team is owned by billionaire Joe Mansueto, a Lightfoot ally. Questions about the deal grew after ProPublica and WTTW-TV published a story about it in June. And
Millionaires taking land from people that need housing. They can afford to buy it elsewhere, but they're taking it from people who need housing.
But when you can get it for under its market value, why wouldn't you do that? Come on, capitalism, Jerry.
I know.
Aren't you a businessman? Come on. CHA officials say the land deals fit into the agency's strategy of mixed income, mixed use.
To your point, Kira, if I didn't have a conscience, I'd be a much richer man.
That's what I always talk about, like the way I made a joke when I was canvassing door to door not too long ago when they were asking me about like what I do for a living. I was like, well, I own a company. I was like, yeah, but I run it. I was like, I run it like a lib, so I make no money. So yeah, I pay my people too much. I take care of people. I make sure that my pricing isn't like gouging people. I even offer a free, my services for free. So it is hard to make money in this system with a conscience. So you're right, Jerry, and actually it's a little heartening to hear you say that, if I'm being honest, because I've been a little down on myself recently.
We'll talk off the air.
My company.
I think we can relate on a lot of
absolutely.
We can vent and commiserate.
I need more of that. So, these reviews are meant to ensure that housing authorities follow a fair and open process, the reviews by HUD, that is, while residents' voices are heard, according to HUD. Except they forgot to do anything about the hearing of the residents' voice. We hear you. Now shut up. By law, local housing authorities are not allowed to dispose of public housing property unless low-income residents will benefit or the property is no longer needed. Records show that since 2011, HUD greenlit every property disposition application, which is more than 100, from housing authorities in Chicago, Atlanta, Baltimore, Memphis, Tennessee, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, all of which have received large revitalization grants from the agency. HUD authorized, man, that is shitty. HUD authorized plans to raise old apartment buildings, transfer land for new housing and redevelopment projects, and sell properties to private investors. So, here's our 99-year-old.
The Wall Street has got the SEC. The developers have got HUD. All of the rich interests in the country have basically got their tentacles in every organization that's supposed to regulate and make sure this shit doesn't happen. They're all co-opted. They've been infiltrated.
Yeah, it's maddening. And it's really heartbreaking when you think about. I think there are 30,000 people still on the wait list for housing for the CHA. So it's disgusting. In 2019, HUD allowed the CHA, get this, you guys, oh my God. This was one example I pulled from the article because it was so outrageous. And there are many, 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 many other examples, y'all. Read the article if you want to be enraged. So HUD allowed the CHA to give an acre of land in the Abla Homes area to a local nonprofit for much less than its market value. Though the appraisal concluded that the parcel was worth $2.7 million, the CHA agreed to lease it to SOS Children's Villages, Illinois, for $1 a year over 99 years. So the nonprofit could build a community center. There's one thing, though. There's a community center 2 blocks away from that location already.
Well, of course there is.
Okay.
They're going to tear that one down.
Yeah, well, and in return, they promised to provide social services to CHA families. So it's like what's been happening is like these organizations, these entities are like, oh yeah, we'll give tennis lessons, which was one of them. I didn't put it into my script. We'll give tennis lessons to people in the housing developments for free.
Yeah,
and then that's how they get these massive deals.
That's their priority, is to learn how to play fucking tennis.
It's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs,
yeah,
okay?
Or sorry, you can't have houses, but we can rent you a couple hours on the courts.
Yeah, exactly. You know what they should do is just go into the courts and start setting up tents.
Right, seriously.
I think that might be a really cool
message.
protest, wouldn't it?
Definitely.
Like, why don't we set up our tent city here on these fucking tennis courts? I love tennis just as much as the next person who loves tennis, but come on.
The masses demand tennis lessons.
Yeah, what we really need to do is we need to draft one of those millionaire class traders to go in and make one of those HUD deals for some land, and then surprise, we'll put public housing on it.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
That'd be a nice turnaround.
It would be. It would definitely be a change in the conversation. In addition, the CHA had only constructed a fraction of the housing units promised for the redevelopment of Apple, which we actually talked about that too, where 3,600 families lived. And similar things are happening with the Old Cabrini Green area and the Ickes areas. So that is that's a little bit of a rundown of what's been going on. I'm looking at some of the other stories, like specific stories that come out around it, and yeah, literally, Excess Tennis, a nonprofit, approached the agency about acquiring 13.5 acres for a new athletic complex. The property, part of the former Robert Taylor home site on the south side, was estimated to be worth $4 million, but CHA agreed to sell it for half of that, when XS promised to provide free tennis lessons and tutoring to low-income youth.
Blowjob! Blowjob!
Yeah. Yep.
$1 million.
No. Half of 4 million is 2
million. So one more time. Oh man. So yeah, so we'll keep our eyes on this, but I think that we know the direction all of this is going to be going into. And what do you guys think about this idea of like mixed purpose? And do you think that is actually helpful for low-income communities to have like mixed purpose housing, the availability for businesses inside the building? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. My first response is you owe them public housing. That should be the first priority.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is secondary. You want to do some combo deal, make sure the public housing is there first.
Yeah.
That's it.
And make sure that whatever else you add is affordable to the people living there.
Yeah.
So that they can't put in stores that people can't afford, and then suddenly that's the priority, and they drive everybody out afterwards.
And that's what I was going to point to, because this
long-term planning, how you can weasel out of it. Right now there's so much, development. I think it was Jimmy Dore was talking about rent control in California, which he thought was a good thing until he discovered that they would. Developers would tear down old buildings so that they didn't have to make them rent control, and only put a limited amount of affordable housing in there that didn't have to be rent controlled anymore. The point I was going to get to is like there's always some kind of a fucking scheme with these developers.
Always.
So go ahead, Kira, to pass it back to what you were thinking.
Well, and to the point that you made earlier, because when you just say that, when you're just like, well, you want like sort of a mix of housing and like opportunity for businesses. I'm thinking, yeah, but we want businesses that the tenants there are going to be interested in, need. Who needs a fucking tennis complex? Nobody needs that. Nobody needs that. Nope. Find a fucking quiet street, like in a suburb.
Except those that are collecting
to
to let you on the court. except those that are at the door to like process your payments to get it in play.
Yeah. But like, I do think and I actually think that CHA residents could probably be business owners in those areas if they were given the opportunity to do that. But these businesses, they get the deals before the building is even built, right? And so it's not like these buildings and these spaces for businesses are being built with the idea that like, oh, we're going to make sure that, folks who are living in these complexes are actually living around businesses that make their lives better, which is supposed to be what HUD is checking for. That's supposed to be what the sieve is, like the barrier there. Like, is this going to be beneficial for the community? And I just don't know how a tennis court or a community center, when there's a community center two blocks away, is all that necessary. And I think that, to your point, Jerry, it's literally just backroom deals going on.
Smoke and mirrors.
And then HUD just says, well, this will benefit the community. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's bullshit.
Shuffling the shells around.
And I do kind of like the idea of setting up a tent city on those tennis courts. Not a bad idea. Not saying anything other than what I just said there.
I have something really quickly to share before we go into your next story.
Mm-hmm.
This came in the email just now. Lightfoot raises another $1 million for re-election bid.
How much, Jerry?
$1 million.
Yes, good work, Ed.
It's all about the money.
Does it?
What a fucking bitch, am I right?
I beg your pardon. What did you say?
Does it say anywhere in that article where the $1 million is coming from? I know you just opened it. So.
Yeah, I didn't actually open the browser, but you know what? Why don't you? I don't want to interrupt the flow of your stories. I just thought it was interesting. Why don't you go to your next story and I can pull that up and.
Yeah, that sounds good because that's certainly the very first curiosity I had when I see that headline.
Okay.
So yeah, just to recap, there are more than 30,000 people who are on CHA's waiting list for public housing and vouchers right now. So, to be building tennis and soccer complexes is irresponsible at best, horribly evil and cold-hearted,
obscene. Yeah.
Like, hello. Okay, so all right, let's move into our next story, which I also thought was, this is so exemplary of the Chicago way. A Lakeview-based Chicago police officer operated an unlicensed private security company and helped run a second unlicensed security firm with his children, and he used Chicago Police Department resources in the operation of both companies.
You forgot.
I look at this town, and I don't like what I see anymore.
That's right. Thanks, Sylvester. Some of the firm's security work was paid for with tax money from the city. The Office of the Inspector General found the cops' company provided security for nightclubs and bars in violation of CPD's rules of conduct. The OIG investigation stretched for more than 5 years, and the accused officer resigned from CPD while the probe was active. When the investigation recently ended, it had been the third oldest active case in OIG. The police officer is not identified by name in the OIG report, but it is Thomas Walsh Sr., whose security company was paid to patrol the Boys Town nightlife strip for years before losing the contract in 2020. At the recommendation of OIG, the police department has designated Walsh's separation from the force as resigned under inquiry. Walsh has also been added to the city's no hire list, according to OIG.
They should have taken all of his money and gone out and bought all the bulletproof vests for the CP department instead of raising it from other places.
Well, and there's a part in this article where they talk about they basically had security officers working for this Walsh security company who were in Chicago police uniforms. even though they weren't police officers, which isn't that like against the law to impersonate a police officer? Like, why are these people not in jail?
It is, but my point being, when the cops are all crying poor, oh, please give us money, help us raise money so we can get our bulletproof vests. They got the money when they're doing this kind of shit. All these unlicensed side deals. How much money did they rake in using police department resources that we're paying for?
Well, it was definitely they had listed some of the income of the Walsh Securities. Because there were two companies, but they listed a couple of them on the Walsh Securities, and they were definitely pulling in over, I think it was over $250,000 a year from the few clients that they listed in the article. The series also made the first public revelation of an ongoing lawsuit and city investigation of Walsh, who was accused of calling Black doorman the N-word and battering him during an off-duty incident. So this guy is a kind of a really bad guy. Walsh's liability, he's a piece of shit. Walsh's liability company paid the bouncer, James Matthews, $300,000 to settle the case. Wow. In June 2020, 7 years after the incident, Walsh was disciplined by the Chicago Police Department. He was suspended for 25 days.
That's all?
Slap on the
arbitrator reduced to after an arbitrator reduced his punishment from 60 days. So it was originally 60 days, and then he got a suspension of 25 days. This dude who basically steals tax money and commits hate crimes. Documents seen by a Lakeview resident showed that Walsh security officers conducted street stops. What? Street stops on people deemed suspicious on the public way. Who does that? The record showed that Walsh guards took pictures of some suspicious people's IDs and sometimes distributed those images to members of a group of neighbors that paid for the patrols. In one instance, shown to CWB Chicago, the suspicious person was delivering food to a house. I think
that's suspicious.
Probably imagine. What's that?
Calling this guy a piece of shit is an insult to other pieces of shit.
Yeah, this guy is, he's something special.
He's got white power written all over his face.
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder what the suspicious persons look like. I'm guessing they have a little bit darker skin than any of us. Yeah, exactly.
Than the rest of us.
Exactly. So CWB Chicago also determined that security guards wearing Walsh security uniforms checked IDs at the door of at least one Boys Town nightclub, and the Chicago police officers were prohibited from participating in operation of bars and nightclubs. So they're just breaking the law all over the place. And not really seeing any repercussions from this.
No accountability. It's CPE. What do you expect? Yeah. Accountability?
I hardly know her. Wait, that doesn't work.
Oh my goodness! Here, he got back pay when he returned.
Yeah, I believe it, man.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh man. In 2016, the line between Walsh Security and Chicago Police Department was so thin that the 19th District Police Commander told Lakeview residents and businesses to call Walsh Security if they had problems during the Pride Parade. Then he provided Walsh's cell phone number. Wow. Nearly all of these activities were happening. Oh, Kathy is going to love this. Nearly all of these activities were happening with the full knowledge of police command staff and local alderman Tom Tunney and James Kappelman.
Kappelman. No, you
gotta given the volume of information our team.
Speaking of James Kappelman.
What a fucking bitch, am I right?
Exactly. So yeah, given the volume of information that the team collected in this investigation, knowing that people who should have been who should have addressed the issues were allowing them to continue. And a substantial amount of taxpayer money was involved. CWB Chicago alerted the OIG in 2017. So it was actually CWB Chicago who alerted the officer of the inspector general about all of this back in July of 2017.
They do good work on that site. I like CWB.
So yeah, I mean, any thoughts before I tell you all where everybody is now?
Oh, we're doing a Where Are They Now segment?
Yes, we're doing a Where Are They Now segment.
Sadly, I don't think it's going to be jail.
No.
I'm excited now.
So
it's a whole new thing for Chicago Corner. Where are they now?
We should do a Where Are They Now segment for things like this all the time.
Thrill us.
Thomas Walsh Sr.'s Walsh Security Company is still paid by a group of Lakeview residents to patrol their neighborhood. The security guards do not conduct street stops. I don't know why, I don't know why that makes me chuckle, because it's very uncomfortable to think about people who are security guards for this private company stopping people on the street. I mean, I guess if you're getting paid by Lakeview residents, because we did talk about how neighborhoods and residents are now hiring private security companies to patrol their neighborhoods. So, I mean, does that include making street stops? I don't think I'd be comfortable as a resident hiring a security company to be like, yeah, why don't you stop people on the street?
Excuse me, ma'am. I see you walking there, and is that the normal way that you walk? Or is, I think we have to stop you just to make sure that you're walking in the way that is normal for people to walk down the street without appearing to be any kind of scary, offensive thing.
Or delivering food, because if you're delivering food while Black, you are a suspicious person. Oh, they didn't say the food delivery person was Black. I'm just making that assumption because of the other parts of the story.
And we also have to make sure, is that food hot? And is it supposed to be?
Yeah, Pat says here, if some private security company person stopped me on the street, the next person they'd be talking to is my lawyer.
I like the way this woman thinks.
Damn straight. So that's going on with Walsh Security. So they're still in business, you guys. They are still fucking in business, making some money, doing the things. The security guard, the Center on Halstead ended its contract with Walsh Security in January of 2020. The North Halstead Business Alliance dropped Walsh in June of 2020 during the strife that followed the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. And Walsh's security company is embroiled in a web of civil lawsuits after one of its officers allegedly shot and killed a man near a North Center bar in November of 2019. Walsh's state security contractor license was put on probation status for 2 years on August 23rd as a result of contractor providing unlicensed private security services, according to Illinois Department of Financial Regulation. And, Walsh didn't reply to an email seeking comment for this story. He was fined $5,000. Walsh Jr. was fined $5,000 and placed his security guard license on probation for 2 years as well. And the state allowed him to work on probationary status as a security contractor until 2021. And state records show that he is now fully licensed to contract security work and work as a security officer. So they're all very successful, having a good time in business, still selling their security services, even though they were impersonating officers and killing people and, harassing people on the street and committing hate crimes.
And constipational conservative still thinks I'm too hard on cops.
Yeah. It's story after story about how corrupt police officers are. I'm not really sure how you continue to live in a land where cops are not like the most terrifying gang members on the street. So,
and continue to make excuses for them all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's the thing. And as Sly says,
I look at this town And I don't like what I see anymore.
Yeah, that's right. Anymore. Come on. It was never that great.
No, continuing.
It's continuing. Exactly. Yeah. So, so if you ever see those Walsh security guard shirts while you're out and about, I was going to say kick them in the junk, but don't do that. Don't do that. I would never condone
they'll arrest
actual
you
violence.
then you have a whole other set of problems.
Right. You'll get in trouble. They won't. You will.
But let's think about things that you wouldn't want to do to them that you could get away with.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Silly string.
You wouldn't want to do that. But actually, that probably would carry some kind of a charge.
It would be like some
because
sort
if you sprayed silly string at a Chicago police officer, they'd scream and run. I'm fearing for my life before they shot you.
Yes, of course. Yeah, don't do
anything. If it was you around your residence, maybe you could like move the sprinklers around just a little bit and oops, sorry, officer.
Yeah, well, Kathy Bauer says call the cops on them. I love that idea.
Yeah, or climb up on your roof with something in a big cooler that you could like dump and then duck, and they wouldn't know where it came from.
Yeah, like Home Alone style, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no. So if you see these Walsh security guards around, I would say just make a big like U around them, and but then they'd probably mark you as suspicious. So
severely scold them.
Yes.
Well, I looked at while you were sharing that story. We don't know where the $1 million came from for Lori Lightfoot, but Ed shared a link that she's blown through more than half of her $1 million. Oh no! She raised another $1 million on top of the $1 million she already blew halfway through. I think, if I'm reading the story correctly. Ed, is that what you got?
Well, from the Sun Times.
Yeah, I'm looking at the.
Yeah, she's blown through about 600,000.
Right. But now the new $1 million that she raised, it does. I'm sure if you go to Illinois Sunshine, you can see who her contributors are to this new $1 million that she raised. But
and we'll of course always be keeping an eye on who's funding whom, and how much money people are bringing in and all of that throughout these races, because who is financing these campaigns obviously is going to have a lot of say in policy that gets passed when those people win. As we all know, that's how it works.
She lags behind self-funded Willie. And I guess Rahm was like the king fundraiser during his 2015 campaign for a second term. At this point in that race, Rahm had raised $8.6 million and was far beyond his opponents. Now, of course, we know Rahm knew he had to raise that kind of cash because he wanted to make sure he could cover up the Laquan McDonald execution too. That money was probably very, very well spent.
I would like to thank the great mayor of the city of Chicago, Mayor Emanuel, for help making this happen today.
Boo!
That's just the best. That is just the best.
That's why I call him the widely reviled Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Lightfoot spending $600,000 so far, they're saying in the Sun Times article that she hasn't aired any TV or radio commercials, but I could swear I had seen one, at least on streaming television, and maybe there's some PACs at play here. Super PACs.
I can also tell you that it's going to take some money to produce some really high quality commercials. So maybe that money's been spent on the commercials and she's got to raise the other $1 million to buy airtime, because
to actually go the airtime.
Yeah. The airtime is actually probably going to be more expensive than the costs producing the spots.
For certain. Yep. Okay. Well, we will keep our eyes on that, like I said. And yep. Kathy donated $1.
Another one?
Yeah, I think another one.
All right, Kathy, we're going to give you some variety now. Let's go with here you go, Kathy.
She's all right. That girl's all right with me.
Strike for that. I just forgot about that one. All right, we'll give you the con next, Kathy. Next donation.
All right. All right. So you guys know that we are, as a city, we're number one in a lot of categories. And we just won number one in yet another category for, I think, the 6th or 7th year in a row. Let's go ahead and play that video.
Okay, well, we got to get to this one. It is a dubious distinction for the second city, Chicago. Ready for this? Number one again when it comes to the rattiest city in the nation. Oregon Pet Control declares us first in rodent infestation for the 8th straight year. New York and Los Angeles round out the top 3. I am shocked it's not New York won.
Look how friendly our little...
Oh, okay.
Our little...
You take one in there for the girls and let's see how friendly they are.
No.
Look at those little claws.
Oh, no, thank you.
Unless you want to talk about Ratatouille. That's the only cutest rat I know.
Okay, sure. Animated rats, totally fine with.
Yeah.
Totally. Fine.
And now, the best part about this news story is like the commentary. The commentary is just
that and the looks.
Like
let's go back to the beginning of this video. Look at how much disdain they have because they know this story they have to start talking about right now. He's like, oh God, rats.
Let's talk about
Why
rats.
did it have to be rats?
Now, Ed, what are you saying here regarding why did it have to be me?
Hey, aren't you in Japan?
Gotta go, sucker.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, the commentary on the story I thought was probably some of the best news commentary I ever heard. But yeah, so more than 60,000 people have complained to Chicago's 311 line between January 1st and November 10th last year in 2021. Just to give you an idea of how we're doing in this competition. Crain's Chicago Business reported that, and the New Yorkers made fewer than 26,000 in the same period of time. And Chicago has a population of 2.71 million, and New York's is 8.42 million. And those population numbers coming from 2019. But I don't know why I did 2019 there and then 2021 for the dates. But whatever, you guys just stay along for the ride here. And Westtown has the highest number of complaints in the city. And that's followed closely by the community areas of Portage Park, Logan Square, and Lakeview. So I know that I used to live in Westtown. I had a parking slab in the rear of my apartment. I was living on Western, right by Armitage, and there were always rats running around in our driveway. And so we'd sit out there and watch them. We didn't have a cat or anything. That would have probably been a good idea.
Did somebody say rat?
But there was an initiative, wasn't there, to get cats out? Like
we reported on a story about I guess helping the feral cat community for the feral cat population, because feral cats in our alleys are actually helping reduce the rat infestation rate.
Yeah, I mean, I have a cat, and I know that she definitely keeps the mice away, and I know that for a fact because she got trapped in our bedroom due to a puppy situation in our house. And then Mark and I discovered a mouse in our house as a result of her being in our bedroom and living there for about 2 weeks. So kitty cats are definitely a wonderful solution for keeping away those little critters. And they're a really cute solution to keeping away those critters. But I don't think anybody's horribly surprised that we're the #1 city in rats. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I see Rom run across my alley every time I pull into my garage.
Honestly, I thought New York would still be #1, but
they have their trash out all over the place. That was my thought. I was like, how do they? Because we have the alleyways and stuff, and I know that New York doesn't have that luxury, and so that would be the only reason. Otherwise, I see plenty of rats around the city.
Bad Cookies has a point. I don't know. New York has some beast rats, and they nest deep in abandoned subway tunnels.
Oh.
Okay. Well, maybe they're just not seeing them.
Yeah, well, because it's 311 calls that they're measuring, and I think, did they say Orkin? Whoever gets rid of like the pest control. I don't think it's Orkin. It's whatever company does that. They report how many calls they get. So there are actually two different ways of watching the rat population.
Now, here's an interesting perspective, though, Kira. They're saying New Yorkers made fewer than 26,000 calls about rats in the same period. That doesn't mean there were less rats. That might just mean that they've become accustomed to them in New York.
Yeah, I mean, that's also true. Yeah, and that's why I think that the calls by the exterminator are probably a little more accurate, but both are still saying that Chicago's number one.
Yeah, I mean, and one piece of evidence would be, the pizza rat. Pretty sure he's from New York. You guys remember that video with the pizza rat?
Yes, I think you were the one that sent it to me. It was somebody from either Hard Lens or Chicago Corner that sent me that video because y'all were talking about it. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it was quite impressive. We're not going to call for 311 for rats here, says Extra Bully. Extra Bulla, who is out of New York. Okay. Well, just wanted to share our victorious win in being the most rat-infested city.
One more thing to be proud about.
Just one more thing. It kind of like when I tell people that I live in Chicago, who don't live in Chicago, they think that I'm like real tough.
Well, you are.
Not really. But it's these, it's all these stories like, oh, isn't it so terrifying to live there? No, no, it's not.
They listen to all the media that paints Chicago as being this hellhole.
Yeah, that's another thing they talk about in Punch 9 is how how the perspective of Chicago changed after Harold Washington got elected mayor.
Yeah,
and how they used to talk about all the violence and everything, and then the conversation when people out of town were talking about Chicago, they say how's Harold?
It's Harold.
So that's another thing we need to look forward to is we need a candidate who can transform the city like Harold did, to help us on the world stage as well,
And it ain't this bitch.
La la la. Let me get my la la la. To be fair, I file my fingers all the time, so I think that's why I find that particularly funny because I kind of do it all the time. Otherwise, I pick my fingers. It's really not. It's not cute, so I have to file them. Otherwise, it's not a good thing. All right, enough about my personal problems. Let's move on to our final story. Because we actually just covered a story last week about a small business in Pilsen being shut down. A hot dog stand called Memo's, or was that what it was called? Am I correct?
Captain Nemo's.
No, we're talking about the last week's story. That was Memo's hot dogs.
Memo's hot dog. Okay, yeah.
For some of you who don't know, Memo is short for Guillermo, which is Spanish for William.
I did not know that about Memo. I did know that about Guillermo, I think. Okay, so now Captain Nemo's have shut down. The legendary sub shop closed its original Clark Street location after its owner opted to shut down the 51-year-old business instead of paying a fine relating to his business license. So I had to read this story 2 times to really understand what the what had gone so wrong here.
Another shakedown.
What's that?
Another shakedown.
And that's essentially what it turns into being. It's the end of an era for this business. It opened in 1971 in Rogers Park, and the problem in Rogers Park, and gained a claim before spawning at least 3 sister locations. Problems with Captain Nemo's business license started in 2019 when the city health inspectors closed the shop at 3650 North Ashland in Lakeview. Owner Steve Ragussi said, instead of bringing the business into compliance with health codes, the Ragussi family decided to just close the Ashland Avenue sub shop. It's like, okay, you know what? Never mind. We'll close up shop here. The following year, Ragussi went to renew the business license for the Rogers Park location, but found there was a hold on it stemming from the health inspection at the sister
Which
location.
he closed.
Which he closed. Fuck you, pay me, is the city's ad. I love his quote here. I'm not going to pay this fine if this is how you're going to run the city, owner Steve Ragussi said. They're trying to get another $400 from me after 50 years.
Yeah.
50
so
years.
Ragussi said he had thought he had gotten the issue squared away and was waiting on a copy of his business license. And then in March, the city notified Ragussi, so kind of them, that his business was operating without a license.
Fuck them, man. Fuck them, fuck them, fuck them. Hey, Gregory Hines, what do you want to say?
Yes!
The abuse against business owners, the disregard for how utterly absurd this is, that this business owner has got to go through this shit. Over $400 is a lot to a business owner. Okay,
Oh,
it's
God,
a lot to the city that they should hassle him for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like the thing about it, really, I mean, it must have been, in my opinion, it must have been somewhat painful to close that location and just make that decision. And it was probably a choice made based on money, right? Whatever the health inspector was saying needed to change probably wasn't worth changing.
Or pay the health inspector.
Or yeah, exactly. And so he said, you know what? All right, we're good, right? That's fine.
Pat's comment, this government is going after small businesses all over the city. First, they destroy them with the COVID stuff. Now they attack them with licensing baloney.
Mm-hmm.
And half of it is just meaningless bureaucracy. It's like they create these systems so that they can collect revenue, and then they make it so hard to navigate when you have some kind of violation, even if it's not intentional. And then when you try to rectify the situation, even if you paid the fine, you don't know if they made sure that it got registered in all the places it needed to be registered. So down the line, something stupid like this doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And so it's like you literally like tear off a piece of your business and you say, okay, fine, we'll close that. And then you think, okay, so there's nothing more tied to this health inspector situation. And then you go to renew the license, and then you're not told that the license wasn't renewed, and then you get fined for doing all the things you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
But then not
what
license and not be told.
You know what might be, and I'd hate to add more bureaucracy to the bureaucracy, but you know what might be helpful here is to have an advocate for small businesses who's familiar with the ins and outs of all the things that you have to do for your licensing and making sure everything's up to code and all of that stuff. And that advocate fights for the small business people, and that they're able to say, look, this is what you need to do, and these are the steps that have to be taken, and then we'll sort this out for you and we'll get you back up and running, because as a small business, you are part of what makes the city work.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yep. That's right. And I'm of the mind that, people who are running small businesses, I have it that in some ways the city should be far more helpful, because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the people to look into all of the details. And so, to Ed's point, having an advocate would be really helpful, and that would actually take some level of either organization and money and effort by the city itself, or just another outside organization, which I'm sure on some level exists somewhere, but they probably can't actually help that many people or that many small businesses, because resources are limited for most organizations, most small businesses, and most just individuals in general. And yeah, and as we see more and more of these small businesses close down, what we'll see popping up more and more is like now instead of Captain Nemo's, you will have a Subway. Right? I mean, I'm not saying I'm not reporting right now that Subway's moving in or anything, but you know,
we don't know what's the future.
Well, we don't
of
know
that
what
spot.
the future holds, but you know, just to say like one sub shop for another isn't an even trade out. You know, because when we have small business owners who are community members, they're
being hassled.
Well, and also, why am I not thinking of the words? They have a vested interest in making sure their community works. And when you spend money in local, there we go. Fashion doesn't like small businesses, only corporations. And when you spend money at local entities, local small businesses, that money gets invested right back into the community. Whereas if a Subway opens up in this place, sure, you can still go get a sub sandwich, I guess. The quality is going to be lower, and that money is going to go to some massive, entity or corporation. Although I do think that Subways are franchised, but they're also over franchised. If you guys know anything about the Subway franchise, so they're just fucking their franchisees over. So, once again, another way to fuck over more community members by taking out the small businesses and moving in larger corporate businesses. So
I would think, sometimes our viewers come and watch us and go, "Oh, why do you hate small business?" I'm like, "No, we don't hate small business."
Who thinks we hate small? Why would they say that?
Or why do you hate cops? Or why do you hate this? And we're like, look, we have perspectives on these things. We bring the stories in here. We talk about them. We try to figure out where people are coming from. Like these guys, like Kathy says, "Hey, Nemos, don't let the door hit you," etc. She says, "Keep the rats out of the kitchen." We don't know what their violation was for, although our previous story suggests that maybe that was a problem. But that doesn't mean that's not something that some of the small businesses can rectify and change, and they shouldn't be hassled by a bunch of red tape just to keep their business going. That's not what regulations and those types of codes are for. They're for safety, public safety, especially if you're selling food. You need to make sure that the food you're selling is sanitized or sanitary.
Yeah, and that's why the initial health inspector, whatever, and it didn't say in this article, and I did look into it, and it didn't say specifically what the original charge was from the health inspector on that Ashland location that he ultimately shut down. But to have, to be under the impression that you're licensed and then you're not licensed because of something that had happened at a previous location, and then getting fined for not having been licensed, even though you took all the steps to get licensed, is just, that's what you're pointing to, Ed, is like, this is just red tape. This is just finding people to find people at this point, and not seeing like, oh, okay, we see where you got the impression that you were in fact licensed because you did all of the things. And we didn't license you because of this other
it's just there's just says that and that's why I was talking about them small businesses needing an advocate, someone who can see things the way we're seeing them and go, "Oh, I see what happened. Let's fix this for you and get you back on your feet."
Right. Exactly. There just needs to be some level of discretion in these conversations, and not just like, sorry.
It shouldn't be an adversarial thing of small business versus city council or whatever, right?
Yeah. Agreed. All right, guys. Well, that's all I got prepared for you tonight. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Ed. Jerry,
it's a good show.
Jerry, great job on getting Joe in here to talk about that film.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for bringing it to light for myself and for our viewers, because I think it's an important story. Just a story about incredible possibility and what could be. And so definitely everybody go watch Punch 9, the documentary out about Harold Washington that is playing in AMC right now. And Ed and Jerry, thanks for joining me tonight. As always, it's been a thin slice. And for the rest of you, I'm Kira Macoun, your Tuesday night Chicago Corner host. And I'll see you next Tuesday.
Get out. And don't come back until you've redeemed yourselves.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.